Like and make sure to engage in comments and share this video to your friends and story lovers, and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifex for more real horror stories like this. It was the kind of thunderstorm that makes your stomach tighten. The air felt charged, thick, as though the storm wasn't just brewing outside, but inside you too. Taylor sat alone in her small one-bedroom apartment. She lived just outside of Baton Rouge, a quiet area where the nights were usually still and peaceful. But tonight was different. The rain pounded against the windows like desperate hands trying to get in. Lightning lit up the dark corners of her living room, exposing the shadows her single lamp couldn't touch. She wasn't scared of storms, not usually. In fact, she kind of liked them. They were like a temporary cleanse, washing away the dirt of the world. But tonight, the storm wasn't just loud, it was angry. The sound of thunder rolled through the walls, low and guttural, like it was alive. Taylor wrapped herself in a blanket, pulling it tight around her shoulders as she sipped her tea. She'd planned on watching a movie to pass the time, but something about the way the wind howled outside made her hesitate. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't entirely alone. It had started earlier that day, a strange feeling she'd tried to ignore. While grocery shopping, she'd caught glimpses of someone watching her. Every time she turned to look, there was no one there. At first, she thought she was imagining things. Maybe she hadn't slept enough, or maybe she was just paranoid from scrolling through too many true crime forums. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Even in her car on the drive home, she couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone sitting in the back seat. Of course, there was no one. She told herself she was just overthinking. Now, sitting in the dim light of her living room, the unease crept back in. Taylor shifted on the couch, trying to convince herself that the storm was playing tricks on her mind. But then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost hesitant. A light tap, tap, tap against her front door. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone, and who in their right mind would be out in a storm like this? The thought of opening the door felt stupid, reckless even. But what if someone needed help? What if it was a neighbor stuck in the rain? Against her better judgment, Taylor got up. The wood floor creaked under her bare feet as she approached the door. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice more confident than she felt. No answer. She waited a few seconds, but all she heard was the rain. Another knock followed, louder this time, as though whoever it was had heard her, but chose not to respond. Taylor's hand hovered over the doorknob. She pressed her eye to the peephole, expecting to see nothing but the empty hallway. But she saw something, or someone. An old woman stood outside, her silver hair matted against her face, drenched from the storm. She wore a long, tattered dress that clung to her thin frame. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips were so thin they looked like they'd disappear if she pressed them together. But it was her eyes that made Taylor freeze. They were wide, unnaturally so, and seemed to reflect the light in the hallway in a way that didn't feel right. Taylor's stomach turned. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice shaking now. The woman didn't answer. She just stood there, staring straight ahead, her eyes unblinking. For a moment, Taylor thought the woman might not have heard her, but then, slowly, the woman tilted her head, just slightly. Taylor's breath caught. She didn't know why, but that small movement filled her with dread. I think you have the wrong apartment," Taylor said, her voice quieter now. She didn't wait for a response. She stepped back from the door and locked it, turning the deadbolt as quickly as her shaking hands allowed. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She told herself she was safe. The woman couldn't get in. But then the knocking started again, louder, harder. It wasn't hesitant anymore. It was demanding. Taylor jumped, stumbling back a few steps. She grabbed her phone from the coffee table and quickly dialed 911. The line rang and rang. She glanced back at the door, half expecting it to burst open. When the operator finally picked up, she stammered through her explanation, her words tumbling over each other. There's this woman outside my door," she said. She looks off. I don't know what she wants, but she won't leave." The operator's calm voice didn't help. They assured her that an officer would be dispatched as soon as possible, but the storm was causing delays. It could be a while. Taylor hung up and clutched the phone to her chest. The knocking had stopped. She stood there for what felt like hours, straining to hear anything over the storm. Just when she started to think the woman might have left, there was a new sound. It came from the window behind her, a slow, deliberate scratching, like nails dragging against the glass. Taylor's blood ran cold. She didn't want to turn around, but the sound was relentless. The scratching didn't stop. It was methodical, deliberate, as though whoever or whatever was outside wanted her to know they were still there. She tightened her grip on her phone and forced herself to look. The window was fogged from the storm, rain streaming down in thick rivulets, distorting the outside view. For a second, she thought it was just the wind, or a tree branch scraping against the glass. But then she saw it. A hand, thin and pale, with gnarled fingers pressed against the glass. It moved slowly, dragging sharp nails down the surface. Taylor stumbled back, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the storm anymore. The woman's face appeared next, partially obscured by the rain. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her wide, unblinking eyes stared directly at Taylor. The woman's lips stretched into what might have been a smile. But it was so wrong, so empty, it made Taylor's skin crawl. She couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were weighed down with cement. All she could do was stare, hoping that somehow she was imagining it, that this was some horrible trick her brain was playing on her. But the woman didn't disappear. She raised one bony finger and tapped the glass, once, twice, 3 times, each tap reverberating through Taylor's chest. "Leave me alone," Taylor finally screamed, her voice breaking. She grabbed the nearest object, a ceramic vase from the side table, and hurled it at the window. The vase shattered on impact, but the glass didn't even crack. The woman didn't flinch. She just kept staring, her fingers still tapping in that slow, deliberate rhythm. Taylor turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going. There wasn't anywhere to go. Her apartment was small, and there was no escape. She locked herself in the bathroom, slamming the door behind her and sinking to the floor. Her breathing was ragged, her hands trembling as she tried to dial 911 again. The call wouldn't go through. Her phone screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. "No, no, no," she muttered, frantically pressing the redial button. But the storm must have knocked out the cell towers, leaving her completely cut off. She pressed her ear to the bathroom door, listening for any sound from the other side. The apartment was eerily quiet now. Even the storm seemed to have calmed, the rain reduced to a faint patter against the windows. It should have been comforting, but the silence only made her more uneasy. And then she heard it, the creak of the floorboards in the living room. Someone was inside. Taylor's stomach dropped. She hadn't heard the door open, hadn't heard anything that would suggest the woman had gotten in, but she was sure of it. The sound was unmistakable. The slow, deliberate steps of someone moving through her apartment. She covered her mouth to keep from screaming. Her mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. She couldn't just sit there and wait. She scanned the bathroom for anything she could use as a weapon, her eyes landing on the heavy porcelain lid of the toilet tank. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Taylor could hear them just outside the bathroom now. She held her breath, clutching the porcelain lid tightly in her hands. The doorknob rattled, a soft testing motion, like whoever was on the other side was making sure it was locked. "Go away," Taylor whispered, tears streaming down her face. The rattling stopped. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then came the voice. It was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a chill down her spine. "Taylor," the woman said, dragging out the syllables of her name. "Let me in, sweetheart." Taylor froze. How did she know her name? The woman's voice grew louder, more insistent. "I just want to talk, Taylor. Don't be rude. Open the door." Taylor shook her head, gripping the porcelain lid so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice cracking. There was a long pause, and then the woman laughed. It was a low, guttural sound that didn't seem like it should come from her frail frame. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time, as though she was trying to force it open. Taylor braced herself, preparing to fight if she had to, but then the rattling stopped, and the footsteps moved away. She listened as they faded into the distance, back toward the living room. She waited for what felt like hours, her ear pressed to the door, straining to hear any sound. Eventually, she worked up the courage to open the door. She stepped out cautiously, the porcelain lid still in her hands. The apartment was empty. The front door was locked, just as she had left it. But the window in the living room was wide open, rain pouring in and soaking the carpet. Taylor's stomach turned as she approached it. She peered outside, half expecting to see the woman standing in the courtyard below. But there was no one there. She was about to close the window when she noticed something on the windowsill. A small wet handprint, too small to belong to the woman. It looked like a child's. Taylor's breath hitched as she stared at the tiny handprint on the windowsill. It wasn't possible. She lived alone, and there hadn't been a child anywhere near her apartment. Not tonight, not ever. Her shaking hand hovered over the print, the water droplets glistening in the faint light of the storm. The childlike shape of the print wasn't just wet, it seemed to shimmer, almost like it was alive. She yanked her hand back, heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. Before she could think too much, the air in the room shifted. It wasn't the kind of shift you could see or even describe. It was the kind you felt deep in your bones. The temperature dropped sharply, her breath now visible in the cold air. Every hair on her body stood on end. The storm outside seemed to fade, the pounding rain and distant thunder giving way to a suffocating silence. That's when the laughter started. It wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the apartment. The laugh was high-pitched, childlike, but warped in a way that made it sound wrong, like it was coming from something trying too hard to mimic a child. Taylor backed away from the window, clutching the porcelain lid like a lifeline. The sound grew louder, echoing through the walls, bouncing off every surface until it felt like the entire room was alive with it. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, but it didn't last long. From the corner of the living room, a shadow moved. It was subtle at first, blending into the already dim light, but as it grew, stretching up the wall like a dark, writhing stain, Taylor realized she wasn't imagining it. The figure began to take shape, emerging from the shadows like it had been waiting there all along. It was the old woman. Her body was twisted in unnatural angles, her limbs too long, her head lolling to the side as though it might fall off. Her milky eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, locking onto Taylor with a hunger that made her legs weaken. But something was different this time. She wasn't alone. Beside her, a smaller figure appeared. It was a child, or at least it looked like one. The small body was drenched, just like the old woman, its clothes clinging to its skin, its hair plastered to its face. But when the child raised its head, Taylor's stomach churned. The child's face was blank, smooth like a mannequin, with no features except for two deep hollow voids where eyes should have been. Taylor's legs finally obeyed her, and she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. "Stay back!" she screamed, raising the porcelain lid like it would do anything against the grotesque figures advancing toward her. The old woman tilted her head again, that eerie, almost smile creeping across her face. Her voice came out in a low rasp, dragging each word as if savoring them. "You shouldn't have let me in, Taylor." "I didn't," Taylor shouted, her voice cracking as she kept moving backward, her back hitting the wall. The woman's smile widened, her teeth yellow and jagged, her eyes unblinking. "Oh, but you did. You looked for me. You saw me. That's all it takes." Taylor shook her head violently, her mind spinning. "No, I don't even know who you are. I didn't do anything." The child's hollow eyes focused on her, and a sharp, guttural scream burst from its mouth, a sound that shouldn't have been possible for something so small. It was deafening, like nails scraping against glass, piercing through her skull and forcing her to drop the porcelain lid. She clamped her hands over her ears, sinking to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The old woman leaned down, her face inches from Taylor's now. The smell of decay radiated off her, thick and suffocating. "It's not about what you've done," she whispered. "It's about what you owe." Taylor's mind raced. What was she talking about? What did she owe? She squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head. "I don't owe you anything. Leave me alone." The woman chuckled, the sound low and guttural, like rocks grinding together. "You'll see, child. It's already begun." Suddenly the child lunged forward, its featureless face inches from Taylor's. In its hollow eyes she saw something. It wasn't her reflection. It was something worse. A flickering image of her own apartment, but it was different. It was dark, empty, the walls covered in what looked like claw marks. And then she saw herself, or something that looked like her, standing in the center of the room, her head tilted at the same unnatural angle as the old woman's. Taylor screamed, snapping her eyes open and throwing her hands out in desperation. The room was empty. The old woman and the child were gone. The shadows had receded, and the storm outside had returned, the rain tapping lightly against the window once more. But the relief was short-lived. Taylor's phone buzzed in her hand, the screen lighting up with an incoming call. Her heart sank as she looked at the number. It was her own. She stared at the screen, paralyzed, as the phone continued to buzz. Against every ounce of instinct, screaming at her to ignore it, she swiped to answer. She raised the phone to her ear, her breath trembling. "Hello?" she whispered. There was no response at first, just static crackling on the other end. Then came the voice. It was hers. "You shouldn't have looked for me." The line went dead. Taylor dropped the phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Before she could process what had just happened, she heard it again, the slow, deliberate tapping. Not at the door this time. It was coming from the mirror. The last thing she saw before the lights in her apartment went out was her reflection, smiling back at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifex for more real and true stories like this.